Well, welcome everyone to the second day of our conference, Religion and its Publics in South Asia. We had a wonderful day yesterday and look forward to two more engaging, exciting, exhilarating panels today. So without further ado, let's start with the first panel. It's titled The Politics of Knowledge and Transmission in Shaping South Asian Publics. And I'd like to introduce our moderator, Dr. Purnima Dhawan. Purnima Dhawan is an associate professor of history at the University of Washington. Her publications include When Sparrows Become Hawks, The Making of the Sikh Warrior Tradition, 1699 to 1799, and essays on Mughal and Sikh history. She's currently working on a new monograph exploring the ways in which literary networks created new identities and notions of common good and shared ethics in Mughal India. Thanks very much, Purnima, and the floor is yours.
Thank you, Rohit. And, my greatest thanks to Rohit and our colleagues at CSLR for having organized such a rich and wonderful opportunity in the midst of all of our pandemic gloom and doom to have this chance to engage with each other and with members of the audience. At a time when misinformation and information is very much in all of our minds, I think this particular panel is also timely and will probably help us grapple with the issues of the asymmetric nature of power relationships and information networks. So I'm really looking forward to our panelists. Before we begin, I'd just like to set out some rules. We are in a webinar format. We encourage our audience participants to put questions in the chat, but please respect the rules of academic and intellectual exchange. Any kind of bullying, harassment, or trolling is not going to be tolerated. Let me begin by introducing the speakers in the order that they are going to be speaking. We have Daniel Morgan, who is at Santa Clara University. Professor Morgan will be presenting Letter Writing as the Mingling of Souls, Remote Knowledge Exchange amongst 18th Century Naqshbandis. Daniel Morgan received his BA and MPhil from the University of Oxford and his PhD from Salk at the University of Chicago in 2021. And I feel like saying congratulations, Daniel, since that is fairly recent. His research focuses on Islamic thought and Sufism in the Mughal Empire with a specific interest in applied cosmological sciences and reformist political theology. He's currently writing an intellectual and social history of the Naqshbandi Sufis of North India in the early modern period, which all of us are looking forward to reading.
Thank you so much to Rohit for inviting me. I'm humbled and very happy to be here with such esteemed colleagues. The paper I'm presenting today is about kind of remote communication, which seems very pertinent to our own time. And it was actually something I'd begun just a few months before the sort of pandemic began, and then it just turned out to be very fortuitous timing. So I'm beginning today with a letter written by the 18th century polymath Shah Waliullah of Delhi, a letter that he sent to his closest disciple, Muhammad Ashik of Pulat. The letter was written in the late summer of 1752, a few weeks after the month of Ramzan, which was for Waliullah a period of seclusion, fasting, and prayer. During this period of seclusion, he received a vision in which Abul Hasan al-Shadhili, a 13th century Maghribi Sufi, had appeared to him pale and sparsely bearded like a flash of lightning. In the vision, Waliullah had been placed in the spiritual station of al-Shadhili himself and was given access to knowledge previously only disclosed to him. After the vision, Waliullah began writing a Persian commentary on one of al-Shadhili's best-known works, Hizb al-Bar. In the letter to Muhammad Ashik, Waliullah writes that his commentary on this text is almost finished. And then he mentions, almost in passing, that once he's completed the first draft, he's going to have another one of his disciples finish a fair copy. And then this finished work would be sent to Muhammad Ashik Pulat. Muhammad Ashik is living in a small village called Pulat, which is about 80 miles northeast of Delhi, near modern-day Muzaffarnagar. So what's notable in this letter is not Waliullah's claim to rarefied spiritual states, which are kind of familiar to us, those of us who work on Sufism, but rather that he considers it completely unexceptional to send a newly written work to his disciple without the need for a face-to-face meeting. This is significant because historians have, for many years, argued for the absolute centrality of oral knowledge transmission in Islamic educational contexts. In such models, we're told that the pervasive focus on orality was rooted in a deep-seated suspicion that Muslim scholars had for the written word, and the concomitant fear that without careful protocols for oral transmission, textual corruptions could easily creep into religious texts. It was only once a student had heard a text that they'd become links in an unbroken chain of authoritative textual transmission, connecting the student to the writer of the text. In such a framework, the spread of the printing press in the early 19th century is understood to have represented a huge epistemological rupture in Muslim societies. The easy availability of texts representing, allowing for unguided reading and a breakdown of the traditional modes of authority, leading to an interpretive free-for-all in the modern period. Although this romanticized depiction of an unchanging model of person-to-person oral transmission of knowledge in the pre-colonial period is not entirely without merit, what is striking is that Naqshbandi letters from late Mughal India routinely mention books being sent by means of privately hired messengers, qasids, often over vast distances. These remotely transmitted books included works of tasawwuf, apotropaic texts, metaphysics, logic, philosophy, Quranic commentary, and poetry. We also find works of hadith, the genre most commonly understood to be reliant on various modes of oral transmission being sent by mail. And in fact, one of the earliest manuscripts of Shah Waliullah's masterpiece, the Hujjat al-Balagha, is in fact one that his son Abdulaziz commissions from like a bizarre copyist and has sent to a friend in Lucknow in 1799, which I discovered in Hyderabad, which I was very excited about. The letters also reveal that these books were being read independently, with students writing to their teachers in distant cities with questions about words or passages that they didn't fully understand. So we know that oral transmission of text was a feature of the intellectual landscape, but the letters demonstrate a marked disregard for the kinds of strict protocols that modern scholarship would lead us to expect. What's noteworthy about these letters is the completely routine way in which such exchanges seem to have occurred. So, how do we explain this phenomenon? Why is it happening? At one level, it's useful to think about the material conditions of the period. The 18th century was one of political fragmentation. And certainly by the 1760s, we see complaints in letters of the dangers of traveling. They just do not want to leave their locality. And they also complain about the decline of patronage. So the kind of people who previously would have funded them to travel to a city and stay for a while, that kind of money is drying up. But what I argue in the article which I am writing is that intellectual trends really play a massive part in this early modern transformation. The scholars in these networks were very aware that their practices differed in certain respects from idealized classical norms, but they explain what they're doing in epistemological, psychological, and spiritual terms, using theories that have been developed at least since the kind of late 17th century. And what they argue is that these remote exchanges of knowledge are not, in fact, a breakdown in person-to-person transmission. Rather, they challenge the idea that person-to-person transmission relies on the physical proximity of two individuals at all. In their view, a person is not merely, or even primarily, a material entity bounded by a corporeal body. Decoupling the idea of personhood from bodily materiality, they argue that companionship does not necessarily require the coming together of two gross material bodies, because at least in its ideal form, it's the communion of two spirits. As a result, face-to-face companionship and letter writing are not seen as completely distinct modes of communication, but rather both are seen as means for creating and invigorating bonds of trust and affect between two spirits. As Shah Waliullah asserts in one letter, written correspondence, mukataba, is a kind of companionship, istihab, or direct address, mukhataba, that occurs despite the separation of two bodies. This transmutation was possible, he writes, because of a certain enchantment that writing produces, allowing for two spirits to commune over distance. In his view, this enchantment was possible because the spiritual bonds that existed between two individuals had their origin in a prematerial state. Face-to-face meetings were thus not in themselves valuable, except as a way to renew and strengthen these prematerial spiritual affinities. although bodily proximity was more efficacious. Epistolography was sometimes said to be superior to face-to-face companionship, as an exchange of letters might make perceptible the spiritual traces of the writers while circumventing the sensuous materiality of their bodies. So, as with their contemporaries in early modern Europe, these scholars felt that letters could substitute for conversations, and with us, in Dina Goodman's memorable phrase, an absence made present. How much time do I have left?
3 minutes.
3 minutes, okay. So Waliullah captures the limitations and potentials of these exchanges in a quite beautiful couplet that he writes in a letter to his friend Muhammad Muin, who lives in Sindh, some 700 miles from Delhi, modern-day Pakistan. And the verse is, what need has friendship for face-to-face meeting? The breeze of Yemen longs even now for the perfume of Arabia. And so the poem's central conceit of a scent-bearing breeze connecting Yemen with Arabia alludes to the relationship formed between the Prophet Muhammad and an otherwise obscure Yemeni shepherd named Uwais al-Qarni. And although Uwais longed to meet the Prophet, he felt duty-bound to remain at home to look after his sick mother. This is the story. Despite their physical separation, the two men develop a close spiritual connection, and Uwais becomes one of the first Muslims. This enigmatic bond, linking two individuals over distance, became a paradigmatic symbol for later Muslim scholars and mystics as they sought to explain how remote communications made it possible for two individuals to generate and maintain ties of friendship and trust when they were unable to meet face to face. And Waliullah and Muhammad Muin, the person to whom he wrote this verse, they had actually only met once in 1731 as Waliullah was traveling to Gujarat on his way to Hijaz. But despite their limited time together, the two men maintained a routine exchange of letters for the next 16 years, ending only with Muhammad Muin's death in 1748. They exchanged mundane kind of griefs and joys and complaints. But also Muhammad Muin sends Waliullah books that are not available in Delhi. There's books of hadith that are circulating in Sindh that Shah Waliullah wants, and so Muhammad Muin sends them. And their spiritual connection, they have increasing sort of intellectual differences, and you can tell they're kind of going in different ways. But throughout their correspondence, there's a strong and sustained mutual affection. And in the highly refined poetic idiom of the period, their connection, spiritual connection, is somewhat counterintuitively described in richly sensuous language. And this kind of spiritual communion is figured using precisely the kind of like olfactory language that appears in the poem, the mingling of the Yemeni breeze and the perfume of Arabia, meant to evoke the idea that it's possible for individuals to meet over great distances, not using the kind of usual senses, the external senses, but using the kind of internal senses, the senses that allow us to feel things like love and grief. And Waliullah basically argues that sensitive people can experience these emotions and internal sensory experiences across vast distances. So to conclude, I'm not trying here to sort of conflate the remote transmission of texts within these networks with the anonymity of print culture in the 19th century. The idea of person-to-person transmission continues to be important, and texts are being circulated within close-knit networks of trust based on intellectual and spiritual attainment. But the letters also seem to disrupt the stark binary that scholars have used between oral and written culture. And the theories outlined here are highly suggestive as we consider why it was that Muslim scholars were so enthusiastic in their adoption of lithographic technologies in the early 19th century. The capacity for reproduction and dissemination of text over distances strengthens trends that were already present within these socio-textual communities. So the letters suggest that we may see the arrival of the lithographic press as creating conditions for a rise in the volume of textual production, but not necessarily a sharp rupture in protocols of textual authorization and transmission.
Thank you, Daniel. Closing out our panel will be Professor Harjeet Singh Garwal from the University of Calgary, who will be talking about Sikh studies and its publics, positionality, autonomy, and responsibility. Dr. Harjeet Singh Garwal, teaches in the Department of Classics and Religion at the University of Calgary. His research is driven by hermeneutical questions from critical religious philosophy, philosophy of language and religious literature discourse, and focuses on the Sikh tradition. Dr. Garewal is currently working on 2 book projects. The first examines Janamsakhi literature and Sikh epistemology, and the second studies diasporic Sikh hip-hop culture, social justice, and activism. What a wonderful combination. Harjeet Singh Garewal, who will be talking about Sikh studies and its publics, positionality, autonomy, and responsibility.
Thank you. My thanks to Dr. Rohit Chopra as well as Emory's CSLR for hosting this important and timely event. I think my talk is a little bit related to more conceptual field to what Supriya was just talking about. And I share some of the concerns as well. Dr. Chopra mentioned yesterday in his opening remarks that one of the reasons for bringing us together was a utopian hope to recuperate a pluralistic and polyphonic way of thinking about religion and its publics. I will discuss the contemporary predicament that scholars of religion find themselves in vis-a-vis the multiple publics and numerous antagonisms they face when presenting their research in this talk. I argue that to think about religion and its public in South Asia requires recognizing both the intentional and unintentional repetitions of formative national moments by Indian elite and their subjects. That's why I think it connects to what Supriya was just talking about, whatever their political stripes may be. In particular, I want to comment on the cyclical reinstantiation of a friend-enemy binary, or Schmidt's concept of the political, to perpetuate communalism in the nation-state framework. The ephemeral and punctuated transmigratory life cycle of communalism is seared into the consciousness of the nation as a futural potential in ways that differ across the diversity inherent within nation-state frameworks. And we're seeing this with the events that were just commented about regarding the hijab. And more recently, a Sikh female was also asked in college there as well to remove her turban. So since at least beginning of the 20th century, there's been an orchestrated attempt to delineate friend from foe using the term religion, quote unquote, and its subcategories to produce publics to foment hatred, often leading to the creation of various forms of violence. I understand religion here somewhat differently as a general category that speaks to the universal and is inherently tied to the secular. So even the use of Hindutva to universalize this, I think, speaks to a problem inherent in religion and its binary secularism, how secularism often is a metaphysical way to disrupt the binary between secular and religion. So for this to be different than a diverse early modern conceptualizations of deen and dharam, which religion continues to overwrite in the contemporary context. And I think the Sikh tradition is particularly relevant to this because it speaks to some of the potentially subaltern currents in the structure of northern India and how these were being contested on the ground in different ways, if we can access the texts in different ways. So I won't get to that in much of my talk, but some of my research does focus on that. So to study religion and its publics, we must examine communalism, the inherently violent social hierarchies and systematic formations of power that reproduce such violence as it pervades public space. I'll close with a brief mention of how to potentially rescue the Gursikh tradition's literature from habitual exoticization and pacification that it experiences in modern discourse in a manner similar to what was suggested by Hamid Dabashi in his book, Truth and Narrative, asking that we reveal the radical political and ethical project seeking to disrupt the political as a friend-enemy binary. The field of Sikh studies has been embroiled in antagonistic responses to scholarship since its arrival in North America around 1978. Further afield, the community, was being rocked by built-up political tensions that erupted violently between two rival sectarian factions in Punjab in an event known today as the Nirankari Kand, so the Nirankari tragedy. Coincidentally, this was the year I was born. While admittedly, I have an interest in hagiography, I can assure you all that this is not my attempt to write one, nor am I trying to fashion some mystic link between me and the field of Sikh studies, however tempting that may be. I mention this rather to signal my positionality vis-a-vis the field I study, one which is marked by attempts to nationalize Sikh subjectivity under the guise of multicultural state policies across different state theaters globally, and the experience of physical, psychological, and economic violence by the community within those different theaters. I'm also aware of being marked as an erstwhile Jat male, while struggling against complicity in the caste system's use of subcaste forms of oppression. So what I'm referring to there is kind of people within subcaste of Shudras potentially fighting amongst themselves and perpetuating the subcaste distinction or the caste distinctions based on subcaste divisions. Discursive and physical violence are written into the lived experience of Sikhs globally. First, through the use of what William Connolly terms the myth of violence, which turns the martial race theory of colonial intervention on its head to suggest that Sikhs are a dangerous threat to the state and its citizens because they are inherently violent, which is basically a reversal of the martial race theory, which says Sikhs will defend the state and the empire because they are inherently violent. The second mechanism is the use of what Harjot Oberoi refers to as the psychohistorical or psychoanalytic historical method. This approach is indebted to the scholarship of Eric Erickson and searches for recognizable archetypes in the archival archaeological record. This psychohistorical method is used to mystify the Sikh tradition following the traumatic and devastating violence of partition to gently suggest Sikhism is a quietist form of nirguna bhakti. This narrative gains preference during the decades of when communalism is ripping through Punjab and is reproduced in national government publications commemorating Guru Nanak's 500th Gurpurb in 1969. The gentle prodding suggested in these narratives is part of and constitute of Sikh studies field in North America as well. And it's connected to the same moment of Guru Nanak's birth anniversary. So to be clear, I'm not suggesting that the narrative was invented in a communalist context in the 20th century. I argue that these trajectories are shifting in post-colonial national context, and they existed in the early modern period and pre-modern period in a different way. The militant pacifist binary was quickly taken up and woven into historiography of the Sikh community, functioning to define a statist perspective by defining the legitimate bounds of the Sikh public and citizenry in India and in other nations. Sikhs who dissent have regularly been met with state or mob violence. Both attempts at epistemicide, to borrow D'Souza Santos's term, and genocide impact the Sikh modern public in multiple ways and inform the antagonism that scholars of Sikh studies face. So scholars of Sikh studies in the West have largely been uninterested in exploring how the advent of the field is cut through by the lived experience of discursive and physical violence of the Sikh community. These things are connected. A violence that the community perceives through the lens of social hierarchy, caste, and imperialism. In the aftermath of Sikh armed altercation with Indian state in 1980 and early 1990s, Sikh scholars were targeted by staunch anti-intellectualism and violent threats, as is well known. Since 9/11, there's been increased prominence given to questions about religion in the public sphere. Sikhs in North America have responded to human rights violations, mass killings, and questions about accommodation of religious communities through an upsurge of social activist networks. But with the exception of a few scholars, there have been mostly kind of a blind eye turned to this in major monographs and research among scholars of Sikh studies. The reality of a living, highly reactive, and potentially volatile community that engages academic discourse places scholars of Sikh studies in a precarious position vis-a-vis scholarly autonomy and public responsibility or accountability. Turning a blind eye to genocide, mass extrajudicial killings, and torture, while scholars choose topics that may be controversial in a way that is perceived as gaslighting by the community, and often is an undercurrent that some Sikhs perceive in the community and scholars are kind of aloof to, and it connects to the criminalization of their dissent. So what does this have to do with Indian publics? Why not try to address the issue of caste injustice and ethics in the context of contemporary India, I suggest actually looking at communal violence rather than putting another veil upon it with the discussion of publics, religion, and the secular. While we should be careful to not be reductive in making these kind of suggestions, it's important to recognize how different philosophies overlay one another in the Indian context, but also that communalism adopts the concept of the political by Schmidt from time to time. And that's important to acknowledge as well. It is vital to look at the university as the perceived colonial tool that exerts an epistemic power and creates discourse based on selective use of empiricist methodologies, linking positivism to the psychohistorical method which Oberoi is talking about. It can potentially debilitate the lived reality and epistemic worlds of other peoples. This most commonly occurs through the regime of general translation and is seen as perpetuating subjugation of colonized people and subjectified people. So I'm going to jump a bit here. So returning to the Sikh studies field, I want to suggest that the issue here is about how communities and scholars can engage one another in plural or pluralistic mechanisms, things that are being suggested within political theory by scholars like William Connolly, his idea of agonistic respect and conceptual bicameralism. This is kind of to adopt and try to think through simultaneously two opposing or multiply opposing epistemologies and try to keep them, rather than reconcile them, keep them in opposition while you talk about them. The continuous repercussion of communal violence impacts both the scholars and communities. This should be recognized, and that there are ways of kind of recuperating the intellectual resources that South Asia has across its immense and diverse epistemologies, which include Islam and Hinduism. We want to use the terms religion. We have yet to think about the narrative of master religion, and I would like to close by suggesting that the pluralistic discourse and the questions of freedom and liberty are important to South Asian thought and can be seen in devotional traditions if we look at them in different ways. And I'll just kind of close by quoting a line from Bhai Gurdas's Vara, a kind of key to the Guru Granth Sahib, where he says, "Sach kinare reh gaya, khay marde baman molane, sir na mite avan jane." So it's talking about the truth is kind of left on the side while Brahmins and Mollahs fight amongst each other. And they're just kind of repeating this cycle over and over again. And it speaks to, I think, some of the things we were talking about yesterday in the investment of caste and caste opposition, and how that lays into and overlays into complicities of other traditions as they enter into South Asia's political spaces. Thank you.
Thank you. And thanks to all the panelists for a really lovely set of rich papers.